In today's video, we are going to talk about if Jesus is the Word of God. And you may watch this video and think to yourself, well, of course Jesus is the Word of God, and that would be the correct way to look at this. But I'm going to break down in today's video just common arguments or common objections that people have to John opening up his gospel account, presenting Jesus as the Word of God who is one with God, but also distinct from God at the same time. So normally this will come up from people who either do two things, either mistranslate John chapter 1, right? The first 18 verses, which we'll talk about more in today's video. And this is typically what you'll see from groups like Jehovah's Witnesses who don't believe that Jesus is God. And because of that, if you read the New World Translation, which is their translation, you will see it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was a God. And they're actually mistranslating what John actually said when he wrote the gospel. The other thing we see is not necessarily a mistranslation, but it's just taking what John is doing here, especially in those first 18 verses in the opening of his gospel account, and just taking it out of context. So obviously John's gospel is clear, and we'll look at that in a moment, but they obviously can't have Jesus being God. These are Muslims will look at it like this. Other people, anti-Trinitarians, will look at this passage and say, no, Jesus isn't God, etc. So in today's video, I want to give you 3 reasons why Jesus is obviously the Word of God, and by John using the word, the Greek word, which is logos for word, he obviously means that Jesus is God. The first reason why we know this is true, and this is not like mistranslating the passage or taking it out of context, is because when we look at the context of what John is actually doing, especially in the first 18 verses, most people know this section of John's gospel as the prologue. This is the foundation, the beginning. Everything which comes after the prologue, the first 18 verses, is built upon the foundation that John lays in those first 18 verses. You're not going to understand most of the stuff, right, in regards to what John talks about at the beginning of the gospel without understanding what he's talking about here first and foremost. So when you think about the foundation, the prologue, the first 18 verses, when you read it contextually, right, this is not John like using this Greek word logos in some like abstract way. People who don't accept this passage, they will say something along the lines of, no, this isn't talking about like a personal person. This is speaking about God's like abstract, his reason, which is one of the interpretations of what the Greek word logos actually means. We don't ever deny it has those meanings. But clearly, when you read through the first 18 verses in John's gospel, you can see that John is using this Greek word logos in a very specific, in a very peculiar way, right? He's not just using as like this abstract idea or this abstract reason and saying that this is what Jesus is. John personalizes the word, which puts it in a separate category, in a different category from other places in the New Testament where this Greek word, or even other places in Greek literature where this Greek word is used. Now, I'm not going to read the first 18 verses in today's video just for sake of time, but you can read it in your own time and see exactly what I'm talking about, right? John is specifically using this Greek word logos in regards to Jesus in a very special way. But we are going to look at some of the verses when we go to our second point now, which is so powerful, which showcases that John isn't just, again, using this Greek word as some reason or some logic. He's actually personalizing it, showcasing that this eternal word has personality. Personality is someone that feels, that thinks, that reasons, that can make decisions, and has personality, basically. Isn't like an abstract thing like a rock or like a pen or something along those lines, right? So we know this is what John's doing, right? We're going to look at a couple of verses here. So first and foremost, let's just start with verse 1, right? John opens up his gospel very similar to how the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, opens up. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God, right? Now, the reason this is so powerful and already showcases, begins to prepare us for this personality which the word has, is if you think about it like this, right? I already mentioned this is a reference back to Genesis, right? So in the beginning, Genesis talks about God creating the heavens and the earth. Now, nobody would say that God isn't personal. It's actually one of the reasons why we know that there's a creator. It's one of the most powerful arguments for God, because in order for us to have what we have existence, to have the universe, the world, etc., it has to be someone who has personality, someone who has a reason to say, you know what, okay, cool, I'm going to create. These things which we see, which are designed, don't just come out of nowhere. They don't just come out of thin air. They come out of an architect, someone with reason who says, I'm going to create. Now, the reason this is significant is because John here in the first verse, what does he do? He mentions this word, but he also distinguishes it from God, but then also says the word was God. So if we look at God as personal, just by being equal and just by being balanced, we'd have to look at the word here, who John's describing, as personal as well. But the point I really want to focus on mainly, right, when you go through these first 18 verses is when John begins to talk about John the Baptist, because this is like so key and showcases again, like powerfully, that the word is personal. Because many people will say, no, the word can't be personal, because they don't like that, because it leans and pushes you towards Trinitarian belief, right? Notice what it says in let's start at verse 6, right? And we'll read a couple verses down. So in verse 6, it says, there was a man sent from God whose name was John. So John the Apostle is writing his gospel and he's introducing this individual, John the Baptist. And notice what he says. He says, the same, John that is, came for a witness to bear witness of the light. Now, this light is synonymous with the word. So you can think about it like when he says the light, he's talking about the word. The word is the light is the word. And we know this because if you go back a couple of verses, right, it talks about in verse 4, in him, speaking about the word, was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shined in the darkness, and it goes on. So the light and the word are synonymous. John is using light and word interchangeably as you read through the flow of the context. So he says in verse 7, picking up, the same came for a witness to bear witness of the light, that all through him might believe, right? Now notice what John does next, which is so powerful. John is a person. He has personality, right? This is obvious. Now what does John the Apostle do as he writes verse 8? He says, he, speaking about John the Baptist, was not that light, but was sent to bear witness of that light. Now, by John the Apostle putting this in his gospel, it showcases right away that anybody who's trying to say that the word is not personal or cannot be personal cannot deal with this verse here in verse 8, where he's talking about John the Baptist and distinguishing the word from John the Baptist. If the word couldn't be personal or was not personal, there would be no reason for him to say, you know, okay, cool, this person I'm telling you about, John the Baptist, isn't the word. Because as like Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, or other anti-Trinitarians who will say, no, this isn't someone who's personal, distinct from God. Why would John have to show us in the gospel that this Logos is not John the Baptist? That obviously showcases that it's easy for people to misunderstand or believe, okay, cool. Is John writing his gospel and saying that John the Baptist is the Logos? He's reinforcing the fact that the word is personal. That's why he has to distinguish the word from somebody else, which is personal. Reason number one is obviously that in the context of the prologue, this is John clearly using this Greek word Logos in a different way to other places in the New Testament. Reason number two is clearly that John, as he's writing his gospel, is distinguishing, he's separating the personality of the word from the personality of John the Baptist, etc. And he wouldn't need to do that if the word wasn't personal. And number three, again, when you just read through the passage, right, I'm going to highlight a couple of verses here where John, for example, in verse 14, he's talking about the word becoming flesh. So look at this, for example. We'll start at verse 10, right? And it says, again, speaking about the word, he was in the world and the world was made by him and the world knew him not. So if we think about the word being this like inanimate, this reason, this logic, right? Logic and reason, like in and of itself, doesn't create, doesn't have the ability to enter creation. That's not what John is explaining clearly for us in the gospel as he starts. He continues, he came unto his own, he says, and his own received him not. But as many as received him, to them gave he the power to become the sons of God, to them that believe on his name, right? Which were born not of blood, nor of the will of flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And verse 14 says, and the word was made flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory as the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. So just to simplify this, as John continues to build up to the crescendo, right, in this prologue, he's talking about the fact that the Word is the one who created all things, which again goes back to the beginning of John's Gospel, which is what he said then, and also goes back to the beginning of the Bible, where God is the one who's creating, etc. So this is the one who's creating all things. Again, if we look at God in the beginning of the Bible as someone who's personal, we'd have to, by the same standard, look at this Word who John's introducing us to in this Gospel by the same standard as well, as someone who's personal. But again, John has distinguished the Word from God in one sense, but also connected him to God in another sense. This Word is entering into his creation. He's becoming flesh. He's being rejected by some. He's being accepted by others. And this is, again, as we read through this prologue, you see quite clearly, don't fall for the trap that, because this Greek word logos, as many people are trying to spread around today, that, this Greek word logos is used in different ways. And you wouldn't say that's God in those passages, so why are we doing it here? And again, this is why context is so important. So these are 3 reasons why you can open up John's Gospel account and read those first 18 verses and see quite clearly that John is using the word logos, not how it's used in other places or just in like Greek thinking in many other places in the time, but he's using it in a specific way which lines up with Old Testament passages to showcase that Jesus is God, but also distinct from God at the same time. If you've got any questions about what I've talked about today, you can leave them in the comment section below, or if you've got anything else on the Bible you want me to talk about in a new video, let me know in the comment sections below as well. But until then, God bless, and I'll see you soon.